When Dolores Jordan went to the bank to wire money for a young person whose life was hanging in the balance, she had no inkling she would be subjected to such public humiliation, let alone handcuffed by the police. What transpired when the officers arrived left everyone utterly speechless. It was one morning when a body had plummeted with a dull thud, a sound that seemed to bring the entire city of Chicago to a momentary standstill. But while hundreds of people remained oblivious, Dolores dropped everything and sprinted over. "Darling, stay with me." Her seasoned hands flew to the girl's wrist. Icy skin, parched lips, eyes that bore the full, crushing weight of impending death. I'm going to die," the young woman whispered, her words slicing through the air like a razor. "Not now. I'm going to help you." Dolores responded with an unwavering resolve that defied fate itself. The girl tried to sit up but collapsed back down. "Leukemia. I have mere weeks left. The treatment, a staggering $1 million. My mother sold everything, and it still wasn't enough. $1 million. For most, such a sum would represent an insurmountable hurdle. But Dolores Jordan was far from ordinary. "What's your name?" Sarah Johnson." "Sarah, listen to me very carefully." Dolores held her trembling hands. "Did you say $1 million?" Sarah nodded, perplexed by the sudden surge of hope in the stranger's voice. "Then today is your lucky day." Dolores stood, extending a hand. "Because you've just met someone who can make that miracle happen." "How? Who are you, ma'am?" Dolores smiled but offered no further explanation. "Let's go to the bank. Now your life begins today." Sarah had no inkling she was about to enter the very bank where her own mother was employed. She was utterly oblivious to the fact that the woman beside her was none other than Michael Jordan's mother. And she certainly could not have foreseen that the ensuing moments would unveil a truth set to irrevocably alter everything. The First National Bank of Chicago stood as a veritable monument to American prosperity. Its white marble columns gleamed in the afternoon sun, creating an impression of unwavering solidity and reliability that reassured even its most affluent clientele. For Sarah, however, the building had always loomed intimidatingly, a stark, constant reminder of everything that lay beyond her grasp. Now walking beside Dolores, she felt a peculiar confluence of hope and terror. The woman beside her had pledged the impossible, and Sarah could not fathom why a complete stranger would undertake such an extraordinary act. "Ma'am," Sarah began, hesitantly, "I don't even know your name." "Dolores," she responded concisely. "Dolores Jordan." The name resonated, yet Sarah couldn't make the connection. Her mind was obscured by illness and the overwhelming emotional maelstrom of the past few minutes. As they entered the bank, Sarah felt a shiver trace her spine. Something was amiss, a premonition she couldn't articulate. Her gaze swept over the familiar environment, the very place her mother had worked for over 15 years, where she had countless times visited as a child. For a moment she considered mentioning that her mother worked there. It might be easier, perhaps expedite the process. But something held her back, perhaps the apprehension of causing trouble for her mother, or the concern that it might complicate matters somehow. "Good afternoon." Dolores addressed the teller's counter with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "I need to make a substantial bank transfer." The employee, a young man with blonde hair and an impeccable suit, quickly scrutinized Dolores. She was simply dressed, dark jeans, a navy blue blouse, flat shoes. Not quite what he expected from someone discussing substantial value. "What kind of sum are you considering?" he inquired, his voice laden with thinly veiled skepticism. $1 million, Dolores replied without hesitation. The ensuing silence was almost palpable. The employee blinked several times, as if attempting to process the information. Other nearby clients turned their heads, piqued by the conversation. "1 million?" he stammered. "Exactly, and I need it to be executed today." I'll call my supervisor," he said, rising abruptly. "For this type of transaction, you'll need to speak with someone more experienced." Sarah observed everything in silence, her heart pounding with increasing intensity. The gravity of what was unfolding began to fully register. This woman, this generous stranger, was genuinely attempting to save her life. A few minutes later, the employee returned accompanied by a middle-aged woman. Sarah felt her world unravel as she recognized the familiar face. It was her mother. Margaret Johnson walked towards them with her customary professional poise, her bank ID badge gleaming on her white blouse. She hadn't seen Sarah yet. Her attention was entirely fixed on Dolores. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her mother was there, just a few feet away, and she didn't know whether to reveal their kinship or remain silent. What kind of cruel coincidence was this? "Good afternoon," Margaret greeted Dolores with her professional smile. "I'm Margaret Johnson, the bank supervisor. I understand you wish to make a high-value transfer?" "That's right," Dolores replied. $1 million. Margaret responded, "Let's move to a private room. Transactions of this magnitude require a more discreet setting." Sarah remained behind, feeling simultaneously relieved and anxious. She watched her mother guide Dolores to the private room, oblivious to the fact that the woman she was treating with professional skepticism was about to save her daughter's life. The premonition Sarah had felt intensified. Something was profoundly wrong, and she couldn't grasp what it was. The bank's private room was a space designed to inspire confidence. Dark wood-paneled walls, a polished mahogany desk, leather chairs that creaked softly when occupied. It was here that the bank's most important clients conducted their business, where fortunes were moved with the discretion of a whispered conversation. Margaret settled behind the desk, her eyes appraising Dolores with the seasoned experience of 15 years dealing with individuals attempting to defraud the banking system. Something about the situation unsettled her. A plainly dressed black woman, casually attired, speaking of transferring $1 million as if it were a trivial sum. "Before we proceed," Margaret began, her voice adopting a more formal tone, "I need to understand the nature of this transfer. $1 million is not a sum that is casually moved." Dolores settled into the chair, her hands clasped in her lap. She had encountered skepticism before, especially in the early years following Michael's success, when people still struggled to believe that a black woman of humble origins could command such significant resources. "I encountered a young woman on the street who requires urgent medical treatment," Dolores explained patiently. "She has a serious illness, and the treatment costs precisely $1 million. I wish to transfer this money to her account." Margaret's brow furrowed. The story sounded overly elaborate, far too convenient. Over her career, she had witnessed countless instances of attempted fraud, many of which commenced with poignant narratives about medical emergencies. "Do you understand that I need to verify not only the provenance of these funds, but also the legitimacy of the transaction?" Margaret inquired, her voice hardening slightly. "Tales of medical emergencies are frequently employed in deceptive ploys." "Deceptive ploys?" Dolores echoed, her tone remarkably composed. "I am attempting to save a young woman's life." "You claim you encountered this person on the street?" Margaret continued, disregarding the burgeoning indignation in Dolores's voice, "and spontaneously decided to disburse $1 million to a complete stranger? It's not a donation, it's an act of compassion," Dolores retorted, her forbearance starting to wane. "Something that appears to be exceedingly scarce these days." Margaret leaned forward, her hands resting on the table. "Madam, with all due respect, your narrative lacks coherence. Ordinary individuals do not keep $1 million in their checking accounts. And even if they did, they certainly don't dispense it to strangers on the street." "Ordinary individuals?" Dolores's voice dropped an octave, a subtle harbinger of peril that Margaret failed to decipher. "Yes, ordinary individuals," Margaret reiterated, her own exasperation beginning to surface. "People who toil diligently for the money they possess. People who do not fabricate outlandish tales to facilitate suspicious transactions." Beyond the glass partition, other employees began to notice the escalating tension. The discussion was growing increasingly animated, punctuated by more emphatic gestures. Sarah, who had remained in the waiting area, also discerned the shift in atmosphere. "I am endeavoring to be patient," Dolores stated, her voice controlled, yet imbued with an intensity that seemed to thicken the air in the room. "But you are questioning my integrity based on what, precisely?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, acutely aware that she was treading on perilous ground. Yet years of rigorous banking training and her own unarticulated prejudices propelled her forward. "Based on the fact that your story is implausible," she declared, her words emerging harsher than intended. Based on the fact that individuals such as yourself do not possess this magnitude of wealth. The ensuing silence was deafening. Dolores remained motionless, her gaze fixed intently on Margaret's face. She had heard those words before, phrased differently, yet always imbued with the same venom. People like me? Dolores asked, her voice perilously quiet. Margaret realized her misstep the instant the words escaped her lips. She attempted to backtrack, but the damage was already done. I meant people who don't exhibit the typical hallmarks of wealth, she faltered, knowing she was only digging herself into a deeper hole. No, Dolores rose slowly, her dignity unmarred despite the affront. You said precisely what you intended to say. The tension in the room had become palpable. Outside the glass-enclosed office, clients and staff began to turn, observing the unfolding confrontation. I'm calling security, Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. People like you don't possess that kind of money, and I will not permit this bank to be utilized for illicit activities. Dolores remained standing, her posture erect, her gaze never leaving Margaret's face. She had confronted racism her entire life, but seldom in such an overt, such a cruel manner. Do it, she stated simply. Call security, call the police, call whomever you wish, but know that you are making a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Margaret picked up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. She knew she was overreacting, yet she couldn't stop herself. Something about Dolores's unwavering confidence profoundly vexed her. Yes, I need security to room 3 immediately, she spoke into the phone, her eyes still locked on Dolores. We have a suspicious situation unfolding here. Outside, Sarah watched everything with mounting horror. She couldn't discern the words, but the body language was unequivocal. Her mother was treating the woman who had pledged to save her as if she were a criminal. The foreboding she had sensed since they entered the bank finally made sense. This was no mere casual encounter. It was a collision of worlds destined to end in tragedy. The arrival of security transformed the bank's atmosphere. 2 uniformed guards approached the glass office with heavy strides, their presence projecting an authority that caused nearby patrons to instinctively recoil. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction seeing the backup arrive, validating her decision to treat Dolores as a threat. What's the issue, Ms. Johnson? Inquired the taller guard, a middle-aged man with broad shoulders and a stern expression honed by years of navigating challenging circumstances. This woman is attempting a fraudulent transfer, Margaret stated, her voice adopting an official cadence. She claims to possess $1 million and wishes to transfer it to a suspicious account. Dolores remained seated, her hands clasped in her lap, observing the unfolding situation with a composure that dramatically contrasted with the commotion around her. Through decades of accumulated experience, she had learned that dignity served as her most potent defense against ignorance. Madam, the guard addressed Dolores, his voice imbued with authority, you will need to stand and accompany us. Accompany you where? Dolores inquired, her voice calm yet resolute. I have committed no crime. That is what we are about to ascertain, Margaret interjected, rising from behind the desk. Attempted bank fraud is a federal offense. Fraud? Dolores slowly rose, her posture erect, her gaze meeting Margaret's. The only deception here is your pretense of being a competent professional. The retort struck Margaret like a physical blow. She felt a flush spread across her countenance, her breathing quickening. No one had ever questioned her professional competence with such directness. How dare you, Margaret practically shrieked, her voice echoing through the glass-paneled room. You come here with your fabricated tales, your preposterous claims, and yet you possess the audacity to question my competence? The volume of the altercation had escalated sufficiently for other bank patrons to begin drawing near. Sarah, who had remained in the waiting area, rose and approached the room, her heart pounding with such intensity that she feared she might faint again. Your narrative is preposterous, Margaret continued, her voice growing increasingly shrill. You claim you encountered a young woman on the street and decided to bestow upon her $1 million? That is ludicrous. It is not ludicrous, Dolores countered, her voice remaining composed despite the provocation. It is humane, something you clearly fail to comprehend. Humane? Margaret scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. What is humane is to work honestly for the money one possesses. What is humane is not to attempt to deceive reputable institutions with fanciful narratives. The guards observed the exchange with increasing discomfort. Despite their training to handle security situations, this was evolving into something far more personal, more venomous. Madam, one of the guards attempted to intercede, perhaps we can resolve this more calmly. There's nothing to resolve, Margaret said, her voice cutting. This woman is attempting to perpetrate fraud, and I will not permit this to transpire in my bank. Your bank? Dolores inquired, an arched eyebrow. Interesting. I wasn't aware you were the proprietor. I've been a supervisor for 15 years, Margaret retorted, feeling her irritation mount. I know fraud when I see it. You know prejudice, Dolores corrected. You see a black woman speaking about money and automatically assume it must be criminal. The accusation dropped into the room like a bombshell. Margaret was rendered momentarily speechless, her mouth agape, opening and closing soundlessly. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. This has nothing to do with race, Margaret finally managed to articulate, though her voice wavered. It's about protecting this bank from illicit activities. Illicit activities, Dolores repeated. Is attempting to save a young woman's life an illicit activity? Fabricating stories to launder illicit funds is, Margaret countered, her voice regaining some of its former strength. And that's precisely what you're doing. Sarah watched everything with mounting horror. She wanted to scream, to rush into the room and explain that Dolores was speaking the truth, that she was genuinely ill, that this benevolent woman was striving to save her life. But her voice seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the sheer magnitude of the unfolding drama. Illicit funds? Dolores queried, her voice low but laden with an intensity that sent a shiver down everyone's spine in the room. Are you accusing me of being a criminal? I'm saying your story doesn't cohere, Margaret replied, feeling cornered yet unable to retreat. I'm saying that people like you do not legitimately possess that kind of wealth. People like me, Dolores repeated, each word cutting like a blade. Once again, people like me. Margaret realized she had crossed a line, but it was too late to retract. Her irritation, her embarrassment, and perhaps something deeper and uglier propelled her forward. Yes, people like you, she said, her voice rising again. Individuals who emerge from nowhere with fabricated narratives, expecting us to credit fairy tales of multi-million-dollar donations. The ensuing silence was punctuated by the sound of Margaret dialing a number on her phone. Police, she uttered, her gaze never wavering from Dolores's face. I need to report an attempted fraud currently underway at the First National Bank. Dolores remained impassive, observing Margaret make the call. Her expression did not shift, but a steely resolve entered her gaze. She had been publicly humiliated, accused of crimes she had not committed, treated as a criminal for attempting to do a benevolent act. Yes, we have a woman here trying to initiate a fraudulent transfer of $1 million, Margaret continued on the phone. I need you to dispatch a patrol car immediately. Outside the room, Sarah felt her legs buckle. She leaned against the wall, her hands trembling, as she watched her mother shatter the sole hope she had for survival. Minutes later, the sound of sirens sliced through the afternoon air like a blade, heralding the arrival of an authority that would escalate an already tense situation into something potentially catastrophic. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of the bank, their red and blue lights flashing against the glass windows and creating a spectacle that drew onlookers on the sidewalk. Sarah felt her world crumble when she saw the officers exiting the vehicles. They were 4 men, all white, all bearing the stern demeanor of those summoned to apprehend a criminal. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, she wanted to do anything to avert what was about to transpire, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. Margaret observed from the private room's window, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. She had made the right decision, she thought. She had safeguarded the bank, protected its clientele, preserved her career. The woman outside could fabricate all the tales she wished, but she would now have to contend with the law. Finally, she murmured, turning to Dolores, who remained seated with the same unshakable composure she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Now let's see what you have to say to the authorities. Dolores raised her eyes to Margaret, and for a moment there was something in her gaze that discomfited the bank supervisor. It was not anger, nor fear, rather something akin to pity. You have no conception of what you've just done, Dolores said softly. The officers entered the bank like an occupying force. Their footsteps resonated across the marble floor, their presence immediately asserting dominance over the space. Clients instinctively recoiled, some discreetly exiting through a side door, others concealing themselves behind columns to observe the unfolding drama. Sergeant Thompson, a tall, lean man with grizzled hair and eyes that had witnessed much in his 2 decades on the force, approached the service counter. His expression was professional, yet a certain obduracy in his gaze suggested he had already drawn conclusions about the situation before even hearing the facts. "Where is the suspect?" he inquired of the bank employee, who nervously gestured towards the glass-paneled office. "There, sir, in room 3 with Supervisor Johnson." Thompson nodded to his colleagues and proceeded towards the room, his steps resolute. He had dealt with bank fraud schemes before, and in his experience, they typically involve desperate individuals attempting to circumvent the system with elaborate narratives. Margaret opened the office door before he even needed to knock. "Sergeant, thank you for coming so promptly," she said, her voice laden with palpable relief. "This woman is attempting to execute a fraudulent transfer of $1 million. Thompson entered the room, his eyes immediately focusing on Dolores. She remained seated, her hands clasped in her lap, observing him with a composure he found immediately suspicious. Seasoned criminals often attempted to project an image of innocence through a facade of tranquility. "Ma'am," he stated, his voice imbued with authority, "I'm Sergeant Thompson. I understand there's a situation here that warrants clarification." "There is no situation here," Dolores responded calmly. "There's merely a misunderstanding that could be swiftly resolved if people were less precipitate in their judgments." "Misunderstanding?" Margaret interjected, her voice again veering into shrillness. "She's attempting to move $1 million with some fanciful tale about assisting a sick young woman." Thompson's brow furrowed. Narratives involving medical emergencies were a common trope in fraud attempts. He had witnessed this dozens of times before. "Ma'am, you'll need to stand up and accompany us," he told Dolores, his hand instinctively gravitating towards the handcuffs on his belt. "We have a few questions to ask you." "Questions that could be posed right here," Dolores replied, slowly rising. "I am not a fugitive." "That's what we'll ascertain," Thompson stated, gesturing to one of his colleagues. "Ma'am, place your hands behind your back." The instant the handcuffs clasped Dolores's wrists, it was like a silent detonation. Everyone in the room felt the gravity of the situation shift instantaneously. Margaret, who had previously felt vindicated, suddenly found herself questioning whether she had overreacted. "Is that truly necessary?" she asked, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Standard protocol for suspected fraud," Thompson replied, adjusting the handcuffs, "especially when sums of this magnitude are involved." Outside the room, Sarah watched everything unfold with absolute horror. The woman who had promised to save her life was being treated like a criminal, and she knew it was her fault. If she had spoken up sooner, if she had mentioned that her mother worked at the bank, perhaps things would be different. Other bank customers also observed, some with morbid curiosity, others with evident discomfort. It was rare to see someone being arrested in a bank, and especially someone who didn't seem to fit the typical profile of a bank criminal. "Sergeant," Dolores said, her voice calm despite the handcuffs, "may I ask a question?" "Go ahead. What exactly is the crime I've allegedly committed?" Thompson hesitated for a moment. Technically, attempting a bank transfer was not a crime, even if the story behind it was suspicious. "Attempted fraud," he said, but his voice sounded less confident. "Attempting to defraud a financial institution?" "Defraud how?" Dolores asked. "By asking to transfer my own money?" "Your money," Margaret interjected, her voice laden with skepticism. "Do you really expect us to believe you legitimately possess $1 million? Dolores turned to Margaret, her handcuffs clinking softly with the movement. "I expect you to open my bank account and see for yourself," she said simply. Thompson and Margaret exchanged glances. It was a reasonable suggestion, something that should have been done from the outset. What's your account number? Margaret asked, moving to her computer. Dolores recited the numbers from memory, her voice clear and confident. Margaret typed rapidly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The screen loaded and Margaret froze. Her eyes widened, her mouth parted slightly, and she blinked several times as if trying to ensure she was reading correctly. This can't be right, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. What is it? Thompson asked, noting the sudden change in Margaret's expression. Margaret remained silent, her eyes fixed on the screen. The numbers didn't lie. The account displayed a balance that made $1 million seem like a trivial sum. What's the balance? Thompson pressed, his own confidence beginning to falter. 17 million, Margaret stated, her voice trembling. 17.5 million. The silence in the room was deafening. Thompson looked at Dolores, who remained composed, almost as if she had been anticipating this revelation. This changes nothing, Margaret asserted, attempting to regain control of the situation. Money can be stolen. It can be acquired illicitly. It can, Dolores conceded, but it wasn't. Sarah from outside observed the shifting expressions within the room. She couldn't hear the words, but she could discern that something significant had transpired. Her mother appeared as though she had seen a ghost. Let's resolve this at the precinct, Thompson stated, his voice, however, having lost some of its previous authority. There we can verify everything properly. Sarah stepped closer and interjected, Let me speak with you. You don't understand. She's trying to help me. Margaret cut her off. My daughter, you shouldn't be here, and certainly not defending a criminal. As Margaret was interrupting Sarah, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, who had been among the first to arrive, had been observing the unfolding situation with increasing discomfort. Wait, he bellowed, his voice cutting through the tension. Don't arrest her. She's Michael Jordan's mother. The confirmation struck like a lightning bolt. Everyone in the room, Thompson, Margaret, Sarah, the other officers, froze. The woman they had treated as a criminal, who had been handcuffed and humiliated, was the mother of one of the most famous individuals in the world. This can't be happening, Margaret murmured, her voice quivering. This can't be happening. Thompson looked at the handcuffs on Dolores's wrists, then at his colleagues, then at Margaret. The full magnitude of the error they had committed began to crystallize. Mrs. Jordan, he uttered, his voice heavy with desperate formality. We need to remove these handcuffs. You certainly do, Dolores replied, but her voice held no anger. It carried something worse, disappointment. As Thompson removed the handcuffs with trembling hands, Sarah watched the entire scene unfold with a mixture of relief and horror. The woman who had promised to save her life was not merely generous. She was Michael Jordan's mother, and her own mother had treated her like a criminal. Mom, Sarah murmured, finally finding her voice, you humiliated Michael Jordan's mother. She is the only one who can save me. The ensuing silence following Sarah's revelation was so profound it seemed to drain all the air from the room. Margaret stood paralyzed, her eyes fixed on her daughter's face, attempting to process the words she had just heard. I did that, my daughter, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, Sarah replied, tears flowing freely now. I am the daughter you claimed you were striving to save. The daughter you failed to save. Margaret felt her legs buckle. She leaned against the table, her breath becoming erratic. The gravity of the situation slammed into her like a runaway train. She had humiliated, treated as a criminal, and ordered the arrest of the only person who could save her own daughter. No, it can't be, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. This can't be happening. Thompson and the other officers watched the scene with growing unease. What had begun as a routine call about bank fraud had morphed into something far more complicated, far more personal. Mrs. Johnson, Thompson said, his voice imbued with an uncomfortable formality. Do you know this young woman? She's my daughter, Margaret replied, her voice broken. She is my daughter, and I've just destroyed her only chance of survival. Dolores observed everything with an expression that blended sorrow and understanding. She had been a mother long enough to recognize the devastating pain on Margaret's face. You haven't destroyed it, Dolores said softly. You've merely made things more difficult. How can you say that? Margaret asked, her tears finally beginning to flow. I treated her like a criminal. I humiliated her. I had her arrested. Yes, you did, Dolores conceded, but that doesn't change the fact that your daughter needs help. Sarah watched her mother crumble, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and anger. She had seen Margaret tirelessly strive to secure the funds for her treatment, had witnessed her mother sacrifice herself in every conceivable way, but she had also seen her mother treat an innocent woman like dirt. Mom, Sarah said, her voice steadier now, you need to know something. Margaret raised her eyes red-rimmed from tears. When I was on the street, dying, no one stopped to help me. No one cared. Except for her, Sarah gestured toward Dolores. She didn't know me, didn't know who I was, didn't even know my mother worked at the bank where she was trying to help me. She simply saw a young woman in dire need and decided to save my life. The words struck Margaret like bullets. Each one underscored the cruel irony of the situation. Her own daughter had been saved by a woman she had treated as a criminal. I didn't know, Margaret murmured. I didn't know it was you. It doesn't matter, Sarah replied. It shouldn't matter. You mistreated her not because she was trying to help me, but because you believed she didn't deserve that money. Thompson decided it was time to intervene. The situation had become far too personal, far too emotional for his comfort. Ms. Jordan, he said, we would like to formally apologize for the misunderstanding. Clearly, there was a miscommunication. A miscommunication? Dolores repeated, her voice laced with subtle irony. Is that what you call it? We? Thompson stammered, perceiving the utter inadequacy of his words for the situation. Sergeant, Dolores said, her voice adopting a more formal tone, I understand you were doing your job, but I hope this serves as a stark reminder that hasty judgments can have serious consequences. Yes, ma'am, Thompson replied, his voice laden with embarrassment. Margaret observed everything with growing horror. She had committed a grave error, had publicly humiliated an innocent woman, had nearly jeopardized her daughter's sole chance of survival. And worse still, she had done all this in public, before colleagues, clients, and police officers. Ms. Jordan, she said, her voice trembling, I don't know what to say. Say nothing, Dolores replied. Not yet. First, let's attend to your daughter. Sarah looked at Dolores with a gratitude she could not articulate. Even after everything that had transpired, even after being publicly humiliated, Dolores was still willing to help. You'll still help me? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. After all this? I pledge to save your life, Dolores replied, and I honor my commitments. Margaret observed the exchange with a mixture of profound gratitude and deep shame. She had encountered an angel, had treated that angel like a demon, and yet, miraculously, the angel was still willing to save her daughter. Why? Margaret asked. Why are you still willing to help after what I've done? Dolores regarded Margaret for a long moment, her eyes laden with a wisdom born of decades of experience. Because, she stated simply, sometimes people are in need of second chances. Sometimes forgiveness is more potent than vengeance. Outside the room, customers and employees observed with a blend of curiosity and discomfort. The situation had become so deeply personal, so emotionally charged, that many felt like voyeurs intruding on a private moment. So, Dolores said, her voice reverting to its practical tone, let us conclude what we have begun. Let us save a life. The return to the private room was akin to a solemn procession. Margaret walked ahead, her steps faltering, her shoulders stooped under the burden of guilt. Sarah followed beside Dolores, her hands trembling as she attempted to process all that had transpired. The police officers remained outside, observing through the glass with expressions of profound discomfort. Margaret sat behind her desk, but for several moments she simply remained there, staring at her hands. Her 15-year banking career, her professional standing, her image as a competent and trustworthy woman, all had been irrevocably shattered in a single afternoon. I don't know where to begin, she said finally, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Commence with your duty, Dolores responded, taking a seat in the opposite chair. Process the transfer. Is that all? Margaret asked, raising her gaze. After all I've done, you merely wish for me to process the transfer? Yes, Dolores replied simply, because your daughter is dying, and bureaucracy will not save her. The words struck Margaret like a physical blow. She had been so fixated on her own shame, her own humiliation, that she had almost forgotten what truly mattered: Sarah's life. "You're right," she said, her hands moving to the keyboard. "You are absolutely right." Sarah watched her mother, seeing her in a completely new light. For months, she had witnessed Margaret struggle to secure funds for her treatment. She had seen her mother sell off all their possessions, mortgage their home, work double shifts. She had seen a desperate woman trying to save her daughter. But now she also saw another facet of her mother: the prejudices, the judgments, the capacity to treat someone as inferior based solely on appearances. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice imbued with a maturity she hadn't possessed that morning, "you need to know how I feel." Margaret stopped typing and looked at her daughter. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me," Sarah continued. "You sacrificed everything, worked tirelessly, never gave up. But I'm also ashamed." "Ashamed?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Ashamed of how you treated the woman who was trying to save me. Ashamed of how you judged her. Ashamed of how you assumed the worst about her simply because she didn't conform to your expectations." The words cut Margaret more deeply than any physical punishment ever could have. To hear her own daughter expressing shame for her actions was devastating. "I was trying to protect the bank," Margaret said, but her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "You were protecting your prejudices," Sarah corrected. "You saw a black woman talking about money and assumed it must be a crime." Dolores observed the exchange between mother and daughter with a mixture of sadness and understanding. She had seen this dynamic before, had faced these prejudices in her own life, but rarely had she seen anyone confronted with the repercussions of their prejudices so directly. "Margaret," Dolores said, her voice gentle but firm, "your daughter is right. You judge me not by my actions, but by the color of my skin." I didn't mean to," Margaret murmured. "Not consciously, perhaps," Dolores corrected, "but you did it nonetheless. And that makes the situation even more tragic." Margaret typed Sarah's account numbers, her hands trembling. Each keystroke seemed to reverberate in the silent room, reminding everyone present of the situation's irony. "The transfer is ready," she said. "I just need your final authorization." Dolores looked at the screen, verifying the details. $1 million transferred directly to Sarah Johnson's account. Money that would save a life. Money that had almost been prevented from being transferred due to sheer prejudice. "I authorize it," she said. Margaret clicked the final button, and the transfer was processed. On screen, the figures shifted, confirming the successful transfer of funds. "It is done," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah gazed at the screen, seeing the confirmation that her life had been saved. Yet instead of relief, she felt an odd melange of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," she said to Dolores. "Thank you for saving my life." "There is no need to thank me," Dolores replied. "You simply need to live well." Margaret observed it all with a profound sense of hollowness. She had achieved her objective, the funds to save her daughter. But the cost had been her dignity, her reputation, and, most significantly, the respect of her own daughter. "Mrs. Jordan," she said, her voice trembling, "there is something I must ask." "You may ask." "Why?" Margaret inquired. "Why are you still willing to assist after everything I have done?" Dolores remained silent for a long moment, contemplating the question. "Because," she finally stated, "I have been where you are. I have been judged by the color of my skin, by my past, by my appearance. I understand the profound pain of being treated as less than you are. Then why not give me my comeuppance? Why not let me face the repercussions?" "Because your daughter does not deserve to perish due to your prejudices," Dolores responded. "And because, deep down, I believe you are capable of being better than you were today." Margaret felt fresh tears well up. She had found forgiveness where she had anticipated vengeance, and grace where she deserved retribution. "I do not deserve your benevolence," she murmured. "No one deserves benevolence," Dolores countered. "That is precisely what renders it so precious." Sarah observed the profound exchange between her mother and Dolores, witnessing something she had never anticipated, her mother being humbled by someone she had treated so appallingly. "Mother," Sarah inquired, "do you grasp the significance of what transpired here today?" Margaret met her daughter's gaze, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed from tears. "I understand," she affirmed. "I understand that I nearly obliterated your sole chance of survival due to my prejudice. I understand that I treated an innocent woman as a criminal. I understand that I must change." "It is not solely about me," Sarah asserted. "It is about your character as a person. It is about how you comport yourself toward those who are different from you." "I know," Margaret replied, "and I will endeavor to do better. I pledge that I will do better." Dolores observed the conversation between mother and daughter, witnessing something she seldom encountered, someone truly confronting their own biases and committing to change. "Margaret," she said, "your daughter is fortunate to have a mother who advocates for her. But Sarah also deserves a mother who treats all people with dignity." "She will," Margaret responded, her voice resolute for the first time since the ordeal had commenced. "She will." 3 months later, Sarah was sitting on the grounds of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the morning sun warming her face. Her hair had begun to regrow, fine and curly, a delicate halo framing a face that had regained its color. The treatment had been resoundingly successful. Not only had it eradicated the leukemia, but it had also afforded her a fresh perspective on life. Margaret approached the bench where Sarah was seated, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an envelope she had been holding on to for weeks. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret asked, sitting beside her daughter. "Better," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee. "Each day a little better." "I have something for you," Margaret said, handing her the envelope. "It's a letter I wrote to Ms. Jordan." Sarah opened the envelope and began to read. The words were carefully chosen, each sentence imbued with genuine remorse and profound gratitude. "Dear Ms. Jordan, no words suffice to express my gratitude for saving my daughter's life. But more importantly, no words can adequately convey my shame for the way I treated you. I have spent the past 3 months reflecting on that day on the bench. I have spent 3 months confronting my own biases, my own judgments, my own capacity to treat another human being as inferior. You showed me that true elegance does not come from expensive clothes or status symbols. It comes from how we treat people, especially those who can offer us nothing in return. You showed me that true wealth lies not in a bank account, but in the ability to discern the humanity in all of us. You showed me that forgiveness can be more powerful than vengeance. My daughter is alive because of your generosity, but I am alive, truly alive, because of your grace. Thank you for saving 2 lives that day. With eternal gratitude, Margaret Johnson." Sarah finished reading the letter, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Are you going to send this?" she asked. "I already sent it," Margaret replied, "along with something else." "What else?" "I'm making monthly donations to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society," Margaret said, "in the name of the Jordan family. It's not much, but it's what I can do." Sarah looked at her mother, seeing the transformation that had occurred over the past few months. Margaret had enrolled in workshops on diversity and inclusion. She had begun reading books on systemic racism. She had begun to question not only her own actions, but also the actions of those around her. "Mom," Sarah said, "you know she didn't expect you to do all this." "I know," Margaret replied, "but I needed to do it. For her, for you, for me." At that moment, they saw a familiar figure approaching. Dolores walked toward them, dressed as simply as ever, but radiating the same dignity that had impressed Sarah on that first day. "Mrs. Jordan." Margaret rose instantly, her voice imbued with deference. "Margaret," Dolores replied, her tone radiating warmth. "I received your letter." "I trust you weren't offended," Margaret said. "I know words cannot truly atone for my actions." "I was not offended," Dolores replied. "Quite the opposite. I was deeply moved. Few possess the fortitude to admit when they are wrong." Sarah rose and embraced Dolores, feeling as though she were embracing an angel. "How can I adequately express my gratitude?" she inquired. "By living," Dolores replied simply. "Living well, being kind to others, making a difference in the world." "There's something I must inform you of," Sarah said. "I've decided to pursue a career in medicine." "Medicine?" Dolores inquired, a brow arched. I wish to specialize in oncology, Sarah said. I want to help others who are enduring what I have endured. That is truly remarkable, Dolores replied, her face beaming with genuine pride. And I shall assist, Margaret added. I'll work extra shifts. I shall support her in every conceivable way. I have no doubt you will, Dolores said, regarding Margaret with approval. They remained silent for a moment, each lost in her own contemplation. The hospital surrounding them pulsed with life. Doctors rushing, families waiting, patients recovering. It was a place of anguish, yet also of profound hope. Mrs. Jordan, Margaret finally uttered, might I pose a question? Certainly. How do you manage to forgive so readily? How do you manage to perceive the good in people even when they mistreat you? Dolores deliberated the question for a prolonged moment, because she finally articulated, harboring resentment is akin to clutching a scorching coal, intending to hurl it at someone. You are the sole one scorched. Furthermore, she continued, I believe people are capable of transformation. I believe we all possess the capacity for betterment. Do you perceive a shift in my character? Margaret inquired. You are evolving, Dolores corrected, and that is all any of us can do. Sarah observed the discourse between her mother and Dolores, witnessing something profoundly beautiful. Two women from disparate backgrounds, who had begun as adversaries, now inextricably linked by a bond of mutual understanding. There is something I wish for you both to understand, Sarah said. That day at the bank wasn't just about saving my life. It was about safeguarding our humanity. How so? Margaret inquired. Mother, you've learned to perceive beyond mere appearances. Mrs. Jordan, you've demonstrated to me that kindness can endure even amidst the most arduous circumstances. And I've come to understand that life is far too precious to be squandered on judgments and prejudices. You are remarkably sagacious for a 20-year-old, Dolores remarked with a smile. A near-death experience tends to have that effect, Sarah rejoined, returning the smile. Margaret observed her daughter, discerning a maturity that had been absent just 3 months prior. The experience had transformed each of them in distinct yet profoundly significant ways. Mrs. Jordan, Margaret said, there's something I feel compelled to ask, and I trust it isn't overly personal. Please do ask. Why were you walking down that street that day? What brought you to Sarah's side? Dolores lapsed into silence for a moment, a distant look in her eyes. I was returning from a visit to the cemetery, she finally divulged. I had been visiting my mother's grave. She succumbed to cancer 15 years ago. Oh, Margaret murmured, her voice imbued with sudden understanding. When I saw Sarah collapse on the pavement, it was as if my mother was urging me to help, as if she were granting me an opportunity to save a life. The words resonated deeply with both Margaret and Sarah. There was a poetic symmetry to the situation that neither of them had previously discerned. So you saved Sarah not merely out of kindness, Margaret posited, but also for your own mother. Perhaps, Dolores responded, or perhaps I saved Sarah because it was simply the right thing to do. Sometimes the underlying motivations are not as paramount as the actions themselves. Sarah felt fresh tears welling up. The realization that she had been rescued by a woman processing her own profound loss, her own grief, rendered the gesture even more profoundly significant. Your mother would be proud, Sarah affirmed. I hope so, Dolores replied. I truly do. They lapsed into silence once more, each engrossed in her own contemplations. The morning sun had grown stronger, warming the hospital garden and fostering an atmosphere of peace and healing. What transpires now? Margaret asked. Now, Dolores stated, you live your lives. Sarah pursues medicine, you continue your work at the bank and your personal journey of growth. And all of us remember the lesson we've learned. What lesson? Sarah inquired. That humanity is more potent than prejudice. That kindness can endure even through the most arduous times. That we are all capable of transformation if we are willing to confront the truth about ourselves. Margaret nodded, comprehension flooding her features. And that forgiveness, she added, can be more potent than vengeance. Precisely, Dolores concurred. Sarah gazed at the two women who had become so pivotal in her life. Her mother, who had striven tirelessly to save her, and Dolores, who had unequivocally succeeded in doing so. You know, she remarked, I used to believe that the most formidable aspect of having cancer was the prospect of death. But now I realize that the greatest challenge was observing how people reacted to my suffering. In what sense? Dolores inquired. Some people treated me as if I were contagious. Others venerated me as if I were a saint. Most simply ostracized me. But you, she met Dolores's gaze, you treated me like a human being in need of assistance. Because that is precisely what you are, Dolores responded simply. And Mother, Sarah continued, turning to Margaret, you demonstrated to me that love can compel us to do both remarkable and appalling things. What do you mean? Margaret queried. You toiled relentlessly to save me. You sacrificed everything. Yet your love for me also led you to treat another woman appallingly because she possessed something you could not bestow upon me. Margaret felt the profound impact of her daughter's words. It was an unpalatable truth to apprehend, yet a truth nonetheless. You are correct, she conceded. My affection for you blinded me to the inherent humanity of others. But now you perceive it, Sarah stated, and that is what truly matters. Dolores observed the exchange between mother and daughter, witnessing a healing unfolding that transcended Sarah's physical recovery. There was an emotional healing, a spiritual healing, manifesting for both of them. Margaret, she ventured, might I offer a suggestion? Certainly. Continue contributing to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, but also contemplate volunteering. Work with families who are navigating circumstances akin to what you both endured. Do you believe I would excel at that? Margaret inquired. After all I've done. I believe you would be ideal, Dolores rejoined, because you comprehend both the caregiver's perspective and the ramifications of prejudice. She is correct, Sarah assented. You could assist other families and concurrently continue your own developmental process. Margaret weighed the suggestion, feeling a nascent hope stir within her chest. I would do it, she said. I genuinely would. Then do so, Dolores said simply. Sarah surveyed the hospital garden, observing other patients and their families. Some laughing, others weeping, all grappling with their individual struggles. You know, she said, I used to loathe hospitals. They reminded me of illness, of mortality, of anguish. And now, Dolores inquired, now I see they are places of hope, places where miracles unfold, places where people reveal their true nature, both their noble and their ignoble aspects. You are justified in seeing hope, Margaret said. You endured. I didn't merely survive, Sarah corrected. I learned to truly live. I learned that life is too precious to be squandered on hatred or resentment. Even after everything you've undergone? Dolores asked. Especially after all I've traversed, Sarah responded, because I know now that life can be snatched from you in an instant. So every moment you have to be kind, to be compassionate, to make a difference. Those moments are gifts. Margaret looked at her daughter, beholding the woman she had blossomed into through suffering and healing. I am so proud of you, she said, her voice quivering with emotion. I am proud of you too, Sarah responded. Proud of how you've transformed, of how you are willing to continue evolving. Dolores observed the exchange between mother and daughter, feeling a profound sense of contentment. She had saved more than a mere life that day at the bank. She had salvaged a relationship. She had catalyzed growth. She had sown seeds of change. Well, she said, rising to her feet, I believe my work here is concluded. Are you leaving? Sarah asked, panic flickering in her eyes. Not forever, Dolores reassured her. But you no longer need me. You have each other, and you possess the tools to continue flourishing. We will always need you, Margaret said. You have imparted so much to us. You learned because you were ready to learn, Dolores responded. That credit belongs to you, not to me. Sarah rose and embraced Dolores again, holding on tightly. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Thank you, Dolores replied, for giving me the chance to make a difference. Margaret too rose, pausing for a moment before advancing. May I? She asked. Dolores opened her arms and Margaret stepped into the embrace. It was awkward at first, but then it became genuine. Two women who had undergone something transformative together. Thank you, Margaret whispered, for forgiving me. for giving me the chance to be better." "We all deserve chances to be better," Dolores replied. When they parted, all three women had tears in their eyes. There was a profound beauty in the moment, something that transcended the pain and conflict that had brought them together. "I'll keep in touch," Dolores promised. "I want to know how you're doing, how Sarah is progressing with her studies. And I want to know about your volunteer work," she said to Margaret. "I want to know how you're helping other families." "We'll keep in touch," Margaret promised, "and we'll never forget what you did for us." "Don't forget," Dolores agreed, "but more importantly, don't forget what you learned about yourselves." Sarah gazed at the two women who had become so important in her life, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and love. "You know," she said, "I used to think the most important thing about surviving cancer was getting back to my old life. But now I realize that the most important thing is to create a new life, a life informed by what you learned through the struggle." "And what kind of life do you want to create?" Dolores asked. "A life dedicated to healing," Sarah replied. "Healing bodies as a physician, healing hearts as a human being, healing communities as someone who understands both suffering and hope." "That's beautiful," Dolores said, "and I know you will succeed." "We will all succeed," Margaret added, "because we learned something precious. That change is possible, that growth is possible, that people can be better than their worst moments." "Exactly," Dolores agreed. "And that love, true love, isn't just about protecting the people you care about. It's about treating all people with dignity and respect." Sarah surveyed the hospital garden once more, seeing it differently now. It was no longer a place of fear and despair. It was a place where miracles unfolded, where people changed, where hope was rekindled. "I'm ready," she said finally. "Ready for what?" "Are you ready to embark on my new life?" Margaret inquired. "Ready to pursue medicine? Ready to make a meaningful impact? Ready to become the person this experience has revealed I could be?" "And we will be there to support you," Margaret pledged. "Always," Dolores affirmed. As they prepared to part ways, each returning to their respective lives, there was a profound sense of completeness. Not because their narratives had concluded, but because they had reached a juncture where they could continue to flourish independently. "One final thing," Sarah stated. "I want you both to understand that that day at the bank, as harrowing as it was also a gift. It was a gift because it revealed our true selves and afforded us the opportunity to become who we aspire to be." "You are exceptionally wise," Dolores remarked, smiling. "I had excellent teachers," Sarah responded, gazing at both women. As they bid their final farewells, there was an inherent beauty to the moment. Three lives had been irrevocably altered by a single afternoon. Three hearts had been laid bare by an act of profound kindness. Three souls had been transformed by a lesson in forgiveness. Sarah watched Dolores depart, her posture erect, her dignity unblemished, her spirit indomitable. She was a woman who had confronted adversity with grace, who had countered cruelty with compassion, who had chosen forgiveness over vengeance. Margaret remained beside her daughter, also observing Dolores's departure. There was so much she still wished to impart, so much she still needed to assimilate, yet she understood that the true endeavor, the task of transforming herself, of becoming a better person, was work she had to undertake independently. "Are you ready to head home?" Margaret inquired. "Yes," Sarah replied. "I am ready." As they walked away from the hospital garden, both women knew their lives would be irrevocably altered. They had been granted a second chance. Sarah a second chance at life, Margaret a second chance to evolve into the individual she aspired to be. And sometimes, second chances are the most invaluable gifts of all. In the years to come, whenever individuals inquired of Sarah about her experience with cancer, she would recount the day she nearly perished on a sidewalk and was rescued by a stranger. She would speak of the profound kindness of a woman who had every reason to depart, yet chose to remain. She would recount the power of forgiveness and the possibility of transformation. Margaret, too, would share the narrative, albeit from a divergent perspective. She would relate the day she nearly jeopardized her daughter's sole chance of survival due to her own ingrained prejudices. She would speak of the profound lessons she learned regarding judging individuals by their outward appearance rather than their intrinsic character. She would narrate how a woman taught her that true dignity stems not from material possessions, but from the manner in which one treats others. And Dolores, when questioned about that day, would simply state that she did what anyone should do upon witnessing someone in need of assistance. She would assert that the true heroes were Margaret and Sarah, who possessed the fortitude to change, to grow, to evolve into superior versions of themselves. Yet all three women would concur on one fundamental truth. That day at the bank, simultaneously dreadful and beautiful, had profoundly taught them that the most vital currency is not monetary wealth, but compassion, that the greatest riches reside not in bank accounts, but in the profound connections forged with fellow human beings, and that the most potent force in the world is not vengeance, but forgiveness. Sarah indeed pursued a career in medicine, becoming one of Chicago's most compassionate oncologists. She never forgot the paramount lesson she had absorbed, the critical importance of treating patients primarily as human beings and only subsequently as medical cases. Margaret embarked on volunteer work with families grappling with cancer, leveraging her own experience to assist others in navigating the intricate emotional landscape that accompanies confronting a life-threatening illness. She became renowned for her ability to guide individuals in confronting their own inherent biases and preconceived notions. And Dolores continued to live her life with the same profound grace and innate dignity that had impressed all who encountered her. She never publicly discussed that day at the bank, never sought acclaim for her act of benevolence. To her, it had simply been the unequivocally right thing to do. Sometimes being shattered is the only way for the light to permeate. If this narrative has resonated with your soul, if it has prompted you to reflect on how we interact with one another, if it has reminded you of the potency of forgiveness and the potential for profound transformation, then you have grasped its essential message. Subscribe to our channel for more narratives that celebrate the resilience, inherent dignity, and boundless capacity for growth within the human spirit. Because all of us have a story to tell, and all of us possess the capacity to transcend our worst moments.